Alrighty, it's been some time since I've done a long form review on this channel. Um, and I figured this would be a good one to do when a contact pointed this out to me. It certainly struck my fancy. Here's the question to go with this article here entitled, "What do you think is the role of scientists when their research gets out into society, and how much should there be concern for the effects of their research potentially on society?" Let's have a review, shall we? So, this one was sent to me, forwarded to me by a contact. It's a Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences article from 2021. Ethics and Society Review, Ethics Reflection as a Precondition to Research Funding. Now, this is where it gets concerning, of course, because you're talking about ethics reflection, right, as a precondition to research funding. More than a little concerning here with that. So it is certainly fun for me when I look at these things as to how to look at this and how to think about some of these things, because you're talking about something that basically is being implied that you cannot receive your grant funding if you go through this thing. And there's a reason for it. And that's the reason I asked the question. It is a very relevant ethics question when it comes to scientific ethics. I am concerned about it being a way to pervert scientific integrity for political interest. Put it that way. Let me read the abstract first, and then there are some things I want to highlight from this that are relevant. As always, this article is linked in the description. It happens to be open access, so you are absolutely welcome to go have a look at it. Researchers in areas as diverse as computer science and political science must increasingly navigate the possible risks of their research to society. However, the history of medical experiments on vulnerable individuals influenced many research ethics reviews to focus exclusively on risks to human subjects rather than risks to human society. We describe an Ethics and Society Review Board, ESR, which fills this moral gap by facilitating ethical and societal reflection as a requirement to access grant funding. Researchers cannot receive grant funding from participating programs until the researchers complete the ESR process for their proposal. Researchers author an initial statement describing their proposed research's risks to society, subgroups within society, and globally, and commit to mitigation strategies for these risks. An interdisciplinary faculty panel iterates with the researchers to refine these risks and mitigation strategies. We describe a mixed method evaluation of ESR over 1 year in partnership with the Artificial Intelligence Grant Program run by Stanford HAI. Okay, point of note here, you should never use acronyms unless you define them in your abstract. Surveys and interviews of researchers who interacted with the ESR found 100% were willing to continue submitting future projects to the ESR, and 58% felt that it had influenced the design of their research project. The ESR panel most commonly identified issues of harms to minority groups, inclusion of diverse stakeholders in the research plan, dual use, and representation of datasets. These principles, paired with the possible mitigation strategies, offered scaffolding for future research designs. So, I want to read the significance statement down here too before we get into this. So, this is what the authors think is the significance of this work, which is technically a research study. As much as it also seems quasi-commentary at the same time when I was reading it through, it is, in fact, a research study. Research fields that hold transformative possibilities for improving the human condition also raise risks of negative ethical and societal outcomes. These ethical and societal risks fall outside the purview of most research reviews. We introduce an iterative review process that draws these fields into reflection and mitigation of ethical and societal risks by conditioning access to grant funding on completion of the process. A 1 year evaluation of our approach with an artificial intelligence funding program at our university suggests that this approach is well received by researchers and positively influenced the design of their research. This process has also generated lists of common risks and mitigation strategies to provide scaffolding for future processes. Okay, there's a lot in there. I want to point out real quick negative ethical and societal outcomes. Would like a definition. This is a significant statement, obviously, so it's not going to be in there because it's just meant to say this is what we think is the significance of our research. 1-year evaluation, but it was entirely done at one university, and it was done at Stanford, which is considered an elite university, and frankly, it seems from the observation of the outside viewer to be skewed in one direction, in terms of the leanings of worldviews and the like amongst the faculty. That's a whole other thing in here, but I want to talk about that because it does play into some of the concerns that I have after reading this and thinking of it as an idea, because the question of whether or not a scientist should be mindful at all, which is actually not something they even talk about here. They're going into this presuming a scientist should be mindful of how their research may impact society as a whole, how it may diffuse through society, and how it could result in potential negative impacts to society, regardless of the fact that they don't really give a sense of what is a negative impact here. And that is kind of problematic when you don't really give that sense. So that is something I would make as a critique right off the top, is they don't even bother to try and point out, to try and justify that a scientist should be mindful of all of these different things, let alone the fact that even if you're thinking about it really carefully and writing it down and what have you, there is no guarantee that some crazy person will use your research in the absolute wrong way. There's no guarantee that won't happen, even for all the mitigation that you may do. There's no guarantee of that. So this is where it gets really, really interesting to me. I go back and forth on the question, because I do think that, at least to a degree, if your research has the potential to make a huge impact on society, yes, you need to be mindful of it. Mindful of what those impacts could be as you're writing up the research. However, it should not be to the deterrent of figuring out what the truth is. You should always be looking for what the truth is if you are a scientist. And it may be something that is negative for society. We have to be honest about that. The truth is something that could be very negative societally. Whether we like that fact or not is irrelevant. And so I just find it concerning that gets ignored, that whole question of whether or not the scientist should be mindful of it. But let's say a scientist should be, because I do kind of partially agree, at least, with that premise. Here's where I get concerned is, should we really be relying on a board of panelists to decide the funding part of it? Because it gets very subjective at that point and very much potentially politicized, these ESR boards. Now, I will give credit, the institutional review boards, and there is a difference, and we'll get into that in a second, the institutional review boards seem to have done a decent job of not getting politicized. So there's potential there that an ESR board, or an ESRB, could itself not become politicized. I don't necessarily think that's the case, though, because you're talking about funding decisions, because the IRB comes in after something has been funded. This ESR, the way they've described it, would come in before something is funded and in part decide whether or not you get the funding. And we'll see in a second. Whether research diffuses into society through technological adoption, through field experiments, or through policy, researchers must reflect on how to identify and mitigate the risks that the diffusion of their work presents to human society. You realize you realize they think it's the scientist's job to do this. They're going in with the assumption you have to reflect on this. You have to reflect on this. Well, why? They never actually go in here and justify the why someone has to reflect on this as a scientist. And do I think they should? Yes, because it's important to understand how your research may be used to a degree. But it should never compromise the search for the truth. You should never be so afraid of what you find, or because some possible risk of harm comes out, some possible risk of harm to society, which is not very well defined in this article, I got to admit. Yeah, some possible risk of some kind of harm to society should not preclude you from looking for the truth. So research ethics review often focuses on risk to human subjects, not risk to human society, placing societal risks out of scope and out of jurisdiction. So what they're talking about there is with most human subjects research, and that's where most of this thing that they're talking about applies, is human subjects research rather than physical sciences. With most of human subjects research, with anything that's involved survey, where you're going to publish the results, focus groups, psychology studies, any kind of things like that, you have to go through what's called an institutional review board. Now, if you need more of a breakdown on that, go back to the video on this channel on the Nature of Human Behavior article, because I talked about that. There's something called the Belmont Report, came out in the 70s, highlighted principles of what you do with research with human subjects, and a lot of those things to make sure researchers are abiding by those particular sets of ethical principles when they're doing research with human subjects and on human subjects must, those IRBs, the institutional review boards, govern that. But as they do correctly, authors correctly point out right here, the common rule governing IRBs specifically disallows review of consequences to human society. The IRB should not consider possible long-range effects of applying knowledge gained in research as those research risks that fall within the purview of, as among those research risks that fall within the purview of its responsibility. So let's see. Not unreasonable to worry about overreach. It is inappropriate to ignore the research poses for our collective future. The risks of AI to the future of work, the risks of sustainability interventions to societies that are purported to support, and the risk of internet to professional media and accurate information. In light of these risks, recent scholarship has argued that research carrying substantial societal risks should undergo ethics review. One thread of this scholarship proposes to expand the definition of human subject to include societies, and IRBs such as the Microsoft Research Ethics Review Program have adopted this expanded purview. An alternative approach directly calls for expanding the common rule to include respect for societies as a principle, or revising it to address substantive ethical issues rather than procedural concerns. A third approach directly seeks to regulate some fields to require ethics review or audits, or enforces it during peer review. Another integrates ethics training into laboratory meetings and course curricula. A focal approach focuses on articulating ethics guidelines by researchers or by professional associations. The goal of our work is to leverage these conceptual and organizational insights to design a concrete process that engages researchers whose work typically falls outside the purview of their institution's current review processes. We introduced the Ethics in Society Review, ESR, a process that facilitates ethical and societal reflection as a requirement to access funding. With the ESR, grant funding from participating institutions is not released until the researchers successfully complete an iterative review process on their proposed project. Conditioning funding on the ESR process helps engage researchers at the formative steps of their research when projects are still open to change, and ensures broad engagement with the process rather than the self-selection of just those who are motivated. So, that's where they're coming from with this. And it certainly presents interesting notions. I will not disagree. It is also still very much concerning because it's a board that can deny you grant funding if you don't satisfy it. Which, as they go on to point out, this ESR thing, in their showing of it here, after the funding program conducts its grant merit review, it sends only the grants recommended for funding to the ESR for the ethics review. So, You've already gone through the merits of the work. You've already passed all those hurdles, and the funding agency wants to fund you. This ESR thing can turn around and say, no, you don't get it after this whole iterative process if you don't meet the thing there. Or that is the proposed idea, let's say. Not just a little concerning. Let's see. Over the 1 to 2 weeks, the faculty panel engages in iterative feedback to the researchers, which includes raising new possible risks, helping identify collaborators or stakeholders, and brainstorming additional mitigation strategies. When the process is complete, the ESR submits its recommendation to the funding program and the funds are released to the researchers. We initiated the ESR in the context of artificial intelligence research in partnership with a grant program run by the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. So, just to make the point here, that should have been in the abstract. Nice. That should have been in the abstract. Okay. While some of the ethical issues raised in the ESR process are particularly salient in AI research publicness, nearly all the issues raised apply to a wide range of disciplines: representativeness, diverse deployment, and design. The ESR statement expressed risks about employers using this technology to surveil and depress the status of workers. In response, the ESR asked for principles to mitigate this risk and specific design decisions that the researchers would make in line with these principles. We report on a year-long mixed method evaluation of the ESR at Stanford University, during which time it reviewed 41 grant proposals. We surveyed and interviewed lead researchers on these projects to understand their experiences with the ESR statements and conduct an inductive analysis of the ESR statements and panel feedback. So, let me go down here. So, this is just in principle what the idea is. Grant application and ESR statement submitted. Merit review. You have the ESR panel review, which is iterative. Goes over and over and over again, with the idea that you should get more to the point where the ESR board is comfortable saying, yeah, this should be funded. It's not going to break any ethics issues. It's not going to have any so-called negative risks to society. Never mind that we don't quite get a really clear example of what negative risk is. And I want to make the point here with that because they do highlight a couple of things. These risks include, for example, the possibility that their contributions to artificial intelligence might exacerbate biases in the criminal justice system, that their urban planning concepts might backfire when implemented, or that their elections research might influence electoral outcomes. Through these projects and many others, researchers must grapple. Okay. My point being with this is that, okay, what do you mean by backfire? What do you mean by backfire? There's no definitional context there to know what you mean by that. Elections research might influence electoral outcomes. Okay. Sure. What if it gets people to vote? What do you mean by negative here? Because these are both something that could be considered not necessarily negative. I mean, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? That's what I'm confused about. They don't really give a whole lot of great examples in this article. So let's see. In collaboration with the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, HAI, the ESR reviewed 6 large grants, $2.5 million over 3 years, and 35 seed grants, $75,000 over 1 year. ESR panelists asked the researchers from all 6 of the large grants, 100%, and 10 of the seed grants to iterate based on the ESR's feedback, of which 3 of the seed grants iterated multiple times. All were eventually supported by the ESR, not as risk-free, but as having appropriate mitigation plans. Okay. $41 grants, effectively. Which the lead researchers, they said they surveyed to get feedback, they surveyed the lead researchers from 35 seed grants. Okay. Here's the thing about that, to make a point. That is a maximum, since you're talking about the lead researchers, that is a maximum of 35 people. That is actually a very small sample size to work with, to begin with. And it's no surprise in the graphics that follow, they actually have no error bars on any of their graphics because they can't. The sample size is just too damn small, to be perfectly frank. Hence the reason they need more study if you're going to go about this thing. To begin with, is it's just too damn small. um, and I would also say it's also only one university, and Stanford has its own kind of elite culture here. That I don't think is necessarily the same as elsewhere. So, overall, researchers wish to continue the ESR process. The survey asked participants whether they would submit to the ESR again. All were willing, figure 2, 95% confidence. See, they put the confidence intervals in here. I would rather that they actually have it here and on the graphics, because you're going to see they don't have it on the graphic in a second. Fact matter, here it is. Not on the graphic at all. And oh, I know what program this is. I know what program this is. What program this graphic was created in. I know that's R. And I know you can do standard error bars in R. You could do that. You could, well, I mean, this is just a count graphic, so maybe not. Okay, count graphics you can't. But, I mean, you could get these things together. Here. Let's see. Those who iterated particularly appreciated. So, the point to make on this is that they only had 10 of them actually iterate. And 3 of them iterated multiple times. They had 10 of the seed grants and 6 of the large grants iterate through this whole thing multiple times. So they really only had 16 go through the whole review process. So maximum of 16 actual researchers. So let's see here. 16 lead researchers, I should say. Those who iterated particularly appreciated the engagement with the panelists and the opportunity to commit some detailed mitigation strategies for ethical concerns. ESR 58% of the self-reported responses indicated that ESR process had influenced the design of their research project. Most projects did not iterate with the ESR, so parts of the process they experienced were writing the ESR statement and reading the ESR panel's feedback. Among those who iterated with the ESR, 67% indicated that the ESR process influenced their design. So this is figure 3 down here, and I want to make a point about this because this is the iterated and no iteration, whether or not it influenced the design of the project. This is all of 1, 2. Yeah, this is all of 6 things here that iterated. Here with the actual ESR. Very small freaking sample size. Very, very small sample size involved here. And, neither agree nor disagree, and that bottom one is the ones who didn't iterate, but thought about it still. That's 4, that's 8, that's 9, 5, 3 and 3. Yeah, 5, 3 and 3, so that's 11. So 9 to 11. So it's actually about 50-50 if I cut it off at the neither agree or disagree and put all the agrees together. So, hey, it's one interpretation is it's really just 50-50 in terms of whether or not they thought it influenced the design. Which kind of makes sense. You had some you had a group that you had almost half that we're not sure, or we don't think so. Or you had a half that, a little more than half that said, yeah. So it really wasn't a majority at all. But anyway. Overall, the research ESR process raised the consciousness of some researchers to engage more seriously with research ethics going forward. When iterating with the ESR, researchers submitted addenda to their original ESR statement that addressed the feedback provided by the panelists. This often included a commitment to additional mitigation strategies that were not outlined in the initial statement. Let's see. The iterative process allowed PIs and panelists to engage in an ongoing conversation about the risks and appropriate mitigation strategies within the proposed research. For example, one project PIs named risks related to representativeness with their initial statement, indicating that they will measure demographic representation in their training data, use diverse data sets where possible, and monitor the performance of their algorithm as it relates to demographic groups in the data. So this is what they're talking about, is the representation problem. And this is where some of the sort of postmodernist stuff can most definitely seep in. Is it what is an adequate representation? Is the interesting question with some of those things. But continuing, let's see. Ultimately, researchers felt that the ESR process made it less likely that their project would misstep and wind up in the public eye for the wrong reason. 73% of survey respondents agreed that the ESR reduced the probability of public criticism of their project, with 100% of those who iterated with the ESR agreeing. In the interviews, researchers indicated that while they did not expect the ESR to shield them from warranted public criticism, the process had better prepared them for potential issues and appropriate ways to address them. Okay. 73% of respondents agreed that the ESR reduced the probability of public criticism. More appropriate way to say that, because you haven't done this anywhere near enough to get enough iterations to know whether or not doing an ESR would actually reduce the probability of criticism. What's a more appropriate way to state the result here is that 73% of surveyed respondents believe that this would reduce the probability of public criticism. That it's not that they know it, rather, it's that they believe that it would. Until you get enough iterations with this thing of those who go through it and those who don't, and how many of those things come up for public criticism and account for as many controlling factors, as many confounding factors as you can. No, you can't say it reduced the probability of public criticism. You can say that you believe it reduced the probability of public criticism. That is a more appropriate way to interpret that 73%, in my view, here as I'm reading this. Let's see here. Issues raised in ESR feedback. Themes most frequently raised by the ESR panel were in order of frequency, harms to subgroups, followed by diverse design and deployment, dual use, representativeness, and issues that fell under IRB purview. In the 26 of 35 seat grant projects, the ESR raised new themes the PIs had not discussed in their ESR statements. So that has to do with this whole long table here. Let's see. Refers to issues that pertain to any risks that arise from insufficient or unequal representation of data participants or intended user population. For example, excluding international low-income students in a study of student well-being. Any risks or concerns, and some of this I gotta say is having gone through IRB review stuff. Some of this would actually be covered by an IRB because they do ask those questions in IRB in some of the IRB stuff. Actually, any risks or concerns regarding the research that fall under IRB purview, incorporating relevant stakeholders and diverse perspectives in a project design and development process. For example, consulting with parents who have been historically disadvantaged to develop fairer school choice mechanisms. Fairer school choice. Love to know what is meant by that, to be truthful. And on it goes with that. Where's the one I really wanted to get into is, here we go. Vesting rejection power in the ESR. We surveyed whether researchers felt that the ESR should be empowered to deny funding to a project. We expected this issue to be quite contentious, but there was generally a consensus via the survey that this was desirable with no moderate or strong disagreement. Among interviewees, although 11 agreed to varying degrees that the ESR should be empowered to reject an especially ethically problematic proposal. Question, of course, is what do you mean by ethically problematic? 5 of those participants strongly encouraged the ESR to prioritize the iterative process over a brute one-sided enforcement mechanism. Many believe that if a researcher does not demonstrate a willingness to engage with the panelists' recommendations and feedback, rejection of the project might be warranted, but only after a deliberative process of exchange between the ESR panel and the researchers. So, here's what I'm wondering about. What if said significant disagreement from the ethical standpoint comes as a result of distinct differences of worldview, and particularly whether or not the submitting researcher believes it is their responsibility to look carefully at the impacts to society, or the potential negative impacts to society, whatever the heck those actually are defined as. Does that mean then that you deny them because they have a difference of worldview from you in the ethics review? That's where I get concerned, because if these things are going to be vested with the power to say you get funding, you don't, based upon our thoughts about how your stuff will impact society, and you need to address what we think there, but you disagree with them, and you have such a strong disagreement that it really doesn't get resolved, does that mean that your grant, which is already past merit review, remember, already past merit review, somebody already wants to pay for it, does that mean then that your grant that is already past merit review, and because this is out there, if this is the kind of thing that were implemented, everybody would know that they'd already passed merit review if the ESR board said, no, you can't have it because we don't like this thing and this thing and this thing because we think it could have. This is the other thing, because it's a could have. This thing could have this negative impact. It could have this negative problem. There's a lot of could haves when you're talking about research diffusing into society. There's the known knowns, there's the known unknowns, and then there's the unknown unknowns. And in a lot of ways, when you're talking about science diffusing into society, there's a huge amount of unknown unknowns that you will never know exactly how your research is going to affect some part of society, particularly if it is extremely groundbreaking and has potential to impact societal policymaking in particular, or local policymaking, or national policymaking, or international policymaking even. You're gonna have no idea how it's going to play and ripple through society. Particularly when you talk about, and I talked about this in the video earlier this week, when you start talking about the notion, the idea that, in particular, one of the things that is, I don't think, thought about carefully in this article, that probably would make it better, and would flush out some of this discussion more, is that quite often the results of research are not immediately shown to the public itself, meaning the public is not presented with an article like this. The public is not going to go read through an article like this. If you're here on YouTube watching me read through it for you, thank you. I appreciate it, for one. But, this is because you're really interested in this stuff. Most of the general public's not going to do that. And I recognize that. They get it mediated through news media, traditionally, cable, newspaper, cable TV, newspaper, all that jazz, and increasingly YouTube, Rumble, video streaming, podcasting, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, all the rest. Although I, for one, think TikTok is a garbage dump of a platform. So, with that, so how are you going to account for those effects? Think about the alphabetism preprint that I mentioned the other day. The alphabetism thing was the idea, these authors, it was a preprint article, but it got all this play in the news media. It was never published, but it got all this play in the news media because it made this claim that if your first letter of your last name is closer to the end of the alphabet, you will have a harder outcome in life. You will have more difficult time in your life. Well, that could have had all sorts of negative societal impacts, potentially, according to this thing. Does that mean that research shouldn't have been done? Does that mean that research shouldn't have been published? If the authors disagreed. And that blew up, that particular thing blew up and went all over the place, although it was never formally peer-reviewed and published. It blew up and went all over the place with news media at the time the preprint was released. And I read the paper, I read the preprint, and it was garbage. No offense to the authors. I'm sorry. That was not a good article. Um so how do you account for things like that? Because that's your unknown unknown. It's an unknown unknown of how science moves through the different mediators and then how it's received by the public through those mediators. You can plan for every damn little thing with this ESR board that could ever possibly happen to make something go wrong. And it will be entirely thrown on its face, cause such a mess because some journalist writes a salacious headline and then misrepresents your work. That is a very real risk that is not talked about here. That you could do everything absolutely right, perfectly, ethically, and what have you, and one journalist misrepresents your work horribly, and then all of a sudden you're in all sorts of hot water because guarantee you policymakers don't read these articles. Policymakers don't read these articles like this. You know, they may read the summary for policymakers. They may read summaries of things, but they're getting their news. And if their constituents suddenly say, "How dare you fund this research that did this based on this salacious news article that completely misrepresents your research," none of that is covered. None of these kinds of scenarios are covered by this ESR kind of thing. It's and yet it would be in a way, if you think it's a good idea that you should have a certain amount of trust in scientists, which is something of a problem right now. That's a way to break trust that is not necessarily the scientist's fault, and potentially is, if you go with that as the benchmark, a negative impact to society. So how do you account for that? So there's a lot of thoughts that come to my mind with this. Evaluation of the ESR, of the first year of the ESR with a large interdisciplinary AI program at a university, suggests that the process can productively involve researchers in an ethical and societal reflection early on in their projects. This is preferable, in our view, to dealing with issues after the project is launched or is submitted for publication. You're not necessarily gonna get everything, like I said. The evaluation feedback highlighted the tension that the ESR must navigate between providing structured criteria and more case-specific feedback. To strike a path forward, the ESR will draw on data from its first year. Instructions for new iterations of the process, available in the appendix, now include a list of the most common risks raised by panelists, as well as example principles for mitigation and resulting research designs for such risk. Articulating guidelines to aid researchers in the previous goal provide benefits here as well. New iterations of the ESR include a first round of triage from doctorate level staff who have expertise in ethics, with the goal of identifying grants that do not require escalation for faculty panel review. Requiring some financial support from each partner program, staff triage can help the program become help the program from becoming too burdensome. There we go. On a small set of faculty. Okay. One point I want to make this is like requiring some financial support from each partner program. Congratulations, you just made the indirect costs that every researcher has to take into account for when they do funding go up, which makes it harder to fund graduate students and staff and what have you that you need to do the research. Just FYI, that is one side effect of this that would indubitably happen, is that you would have to raise the indirect cost to support the new ESR board if you're talking about some kind of payment like that. Let's see. Our model is not one where faculty who are trained in ethics point fingers at faculty trained in other areas. When possible, we pursue the metaphor of coach rather than reviewer. This interactive model is a feature and not a bug of the process. As a result, as the ESR must navigate cultural change in the practice of research and translation across fields. And this is where I come back to the conflicts that could happen with differing viewpoints. Because there are some of us that are not there are some folks who had values that kind of that are different from the current culture of academia. So how are you going to navigate that? That's what I'm going to point out there. And I've seen this also with the DEI statements, and I do wonder if it would make it happen in this case. If you have to go through this for funding, but you think the ESR board is full of crap, how much incentive do you have to lie about doing some X and X mitigation and X again X thing? So this is kind of one of the things I'm curious about with this. How should the ESR handle conflicts of interest? These issues did not arise in our deployment, but neither did the ESR collect information on, for example, whether outside funding or market opportunities might bias a researcher to focus on particular topics or populations. One approach would be to ask the researchers to self-disclose any current or potential conflicts. Can we do the same thing with the panelists? For example, what about a conflict of interest with respect to, say, a panelist or a researcher has strong ties, connections with a political group, such as, think of any number of different political groups. There's a few different ones that have come to mind. There's a lot of left-leaning ones that come to mind in particular because academia right now is currently, for the most part, very left. At least in my observation and in such studies that I have been able to find, most faculty are more left of center than right. So how do you account for those conflicts of interest and the bias associated with worldview in the panelists? Not necessarily just in the researcher. People are forgetting the bias of the researcher is one thing. But what about the bias of the panelists? Is there going to be a situation where the panelists of the faculty panelists are biased against a particular researcher for whatever godforsaken reason in the political machinations of the academic world? One intriguing okay, so they're talking about continued things here because there are annual reports sometimes required with grants. So you have to update your ESR once a year. Programs includes currently expanding the ESR from AI research to other research areas and other funding programs. These programs include sustainability, bioengineering, behavioral science projects involving community partners. Separate faculty panels must be recruited for these programs as they require a somewhat different set of ethical expertise and on-the-ground knowledge of risks. So, yeah. I immediately thought of the actionable science world when I read that statement, because that's where it's going to go next. And actionable science includes a number of connections with physical sciences and what have you that are important here. So, this is where we get to the point of we're moving beyond the literature, shall we say. Not the literature. We're moving beyond human subjects. We're talking about everybody in a community. And that's, again, where I get worried about what kind of political narratives are going to be pushed on the researchers this way for them to be forced into working towards it with regards to a particular political narrative rather than making sure it's good and what have you. This is why I don't necessarily like this idea. You cannot necessarily say that the panelists themselves are not going to try and push people toward a particular worldview, and particularly postmodern one, which is a mess. Postmodernism is such a hot mess. Let's see. Yeah, here you go. By using funding decisions as an incentive for ESR participation, we alleviate self-selection concerns as inherent involuntary ethics and societal review processes, but cannot reach those who do not require grant funding. At the same time, we hope that if researchers begin engaging in this process through grant funding, it might help facilitate a culture shift to include projects that do not require grant funding. In other words, a little bit of peer pressure. Growing beyond the university may make it more feasible for journals and conferences to consider ESR review as a requirement. Why should it be a requirement? I'm not necessarily sold on this should be a requirement at all. And just saying more and more people are doing it is not an acceptable reason for asking journals and conferences to do it. The The current evaluation may be subject to novelty effects, with researchers reacting more positively to the process due to it being different from their usual patterns. It also suffers from a small sample size problem. Totally other thing. That is small. That is a very, very small sample size, given that you had very few that actually iterated with the ESR process altogether, and very few still. If you're talking about 41 total, 35 at most PIs who did the survey, it's still a small number. You're suffering from a lot of small sample size, too. Research that has additionally no project was ultimately denied funding. Our data do not yet cover this case. Finally, this multi-method study was also not randomized, so we do not make any causal claims. So we cannot and do not make any causal claims, excuse me. So there's that. Research that has the risk of negatively affecting society. What do you mean by a negative effect on society? This is never clearly spelt out. I don't know what you mean with this. That's where I'm completely confused. And again, with the unknown unknowns thing, you could do it all perfectly right and have somebody blow it up in your face later with public criticism coming from a salacious and incorrect news article. Either immediately or through downstream applications, falls outside the jurisdiction of many of existing review procedures because many of these procedures exclude societal risks of harm. Well, yeah, no kidding. That's a very circular statement. In this article, we introduce a process that operates in collaboration with a funding program to encourage ethical and societal reflection, only releasing grant funding when ethical and societal reflection is complete. Evaluation of the process over 1 year suggests that researchers found it valuable to broadening their ethical lenses and are willing to continue to submit to it despite added commitment. Let's see. This is in materials and methods. The most critical institutional feature of the ESR is the collaboration with a funding program. This collaboration enables completion of the ESR process to trigger the release of funds. Funding is a rare moment of institutional leverage in a university. While most AI research proceeds without IRB review at our university, researchers are often in search of funding. Think of how scary that is, actually. Most everything... Hello, darling. We're going to have a cat up here on camera. Most everything is done here. Most everything that research is done has to be paid for by something. Oh, darling. I was not expecting my cat to come talk to me during the recording, but that is okay. You can stay if you want to. I don't mind. I don't mind, and I don't think my audience minds. Yeah. But it certainly is a concern when you're putting it this way, because it's almost like, well, you gotta go through this if you want your money. You gotta do this thing we want you to do if you want any money to do your research. And for a lot of scientists who are what we call soft money funded, which is to say they basically make their whole life off of getting grants and paying for themselves and their students that way. When you're talking about something like that, where it is soft money funded and you're entirely dependent upon grant funding, to have something like this, which is almost feels like a threat a little bit, to say, no, you got to do this thing. You got to do this thing or you won't get paid. It's more than a little concerning to see something like that. And it makes me, it worries me. Let's see. This is the last one I wanted to talk about. Hey, don't knock over my water. The ESR panel, the ESR faculty panel is composed to bring together diverse intellectual perspectives on society, ethics, and technology. Our panel thus far represents faculty from the humanities, social sciences, engineering, and medicine, and the life sciences. Their departments at our institution include anthropology, communication, computer science, history, management science, and engineering, medicine, philosophy, political science, and sociology. Their interests include algorithms and society, gender, race, ethics, history of technology, collective action, medical anthropology, moral beliefs, medical ethics, social networks, AI, robotics, and human-computer interaction. Many other disciplines and identities can and should be included as well. I'm glad they say that. Can you include somebody who has a bunch of people who have completely different worldviews from each other, like ones who are not bent in the postmodern world and ones that are, well, ones that are postmodern and ones that are not? Can you include folks who are conservative and folks who are liberal? The reason I say this is because that can mitigate some of the problems that I'm really concerned about. That funding is denied because of a difference of worldview. Is if your ESR panel comprises things that are very different worldviews of people, and very different views on what the role of scientists should be with regard to their research in society. So that's the main thing I wanted to talk about here, because it certainly is an interesting topic. The idea that, before you get funded, you should show us that you've thought about the risks that your research could present to society or the potential negative impacts of your research. Bearing in mind that these are things that may happen, not things that will happen. And that in this case, there are, I like to think of it in the way I was describing before: known knowns, your known unknowns, and your unknown unknowns. Things that you'd have no idea could happen that could completely make it a mess. Distinctly possible. Distinctly possible, despite the best laid plan, someone manipulates, twists your research, the representation of it, once it gets out and done, and you get your name dragged through the mud because of it. That's not impossible to happen. And in fact, I would suspect it has happened a few times. And I think I talked about it on this channel, how Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the whole thing about 12 years to live, right? Well, she was completely misreading what the research actually said on that. And she was entirely wrong. And yet that's what's stuck in the lexicon, and we're still trying to get back because she said it. She's a popular figure. She was utterly and completely misrepresenting the report that she was referring to, because the report did not say that. But she's, at the same time, congresswoman with a massive following on social media who just said something completely wrong. Completely wrong about a scientific topic. So what do you do in that situation? In all seriousness, what do you do? This kind of ESR thing would never be able to account for that. Because there are things like that happen. And to be honest, there's nothing about what I've read in this article that alleviates my concern that this would be a tool to force scientists to do things according to a particular worldview and belief system, and particularly with the increasing influence of postmodernist thought everywhere, which postmodernism is not a fan of looking at things for the truth. It's all about power for postmodernists. This would be dramatically concerning to see an ESR like this just start denying people funding because of what would amount to a difference in worldview. And so, funny enough, for the sake of diversity, you end up getting rid of diversity again, right? So I appreciate that they're doing this. I think this is interesting. I also, again, will point out it's a small sample size, very small sample size to work with. Being it's only 35 authors that you had in the survey and 40 some odd grants to begin with that you iterated. And even, 41 some odd grants that submitted, but only, I think it was a very small number that actually did the iteration. So, excuse me. So I don't know. I don't honestly know with this one, and it's more than a little concerning, but I would ask the authors this question. How would you go about preventing the ESR board or the ESR boards from being politicized and manipulated to the point where you are then compromising scientific integrity? And you are then making sure that scientists are constructing their research in such a manner that they're getting a desired outcome that the ESR board wants, but not what is necessarily the truth. Because at the end of the day, scientific research is about the pursuit of the truth. And to put it bluntly, sometimes the truth hurts. So sometimes it fucking sucks. But it is still the best thing upon which to make decisions. Regardless of whatever you think the risks are sometimes to society. Not saying don't be mindful of it, but I don't agree with the idea of placing all power for deciding funding decisions after it's already been approved for the merit of the work. I don't think having an ethics board shutting it down completely for risks that could happen, but may not, because you're afraid those risks, the resulting true things that the researcher may find, would be detrimental to society. Whatever you mean by detrimental to society or negative societal impacts. It could reveal something negative about society, which could be really bad. Could also reveal something positive. But if there was something amiss societally that you really wanted to, that you found in your research, as much as it caused discomfort, would you not want to know it so that you could perhaps correct it somewhere down the line, or figure out how to correct it, or perhaps do more research to figure out, oh, wait a minute, is this really still a thing? Because obviously with repetition, you get to realize if the pattern repeats, if you do the study over and over and over again multiple times and the pattern repeats, well, obviously you found something problematic that you need to fix, right? Not problematic. You found a problem or a potential problem that you would need to fix. You want to know it. And they really haven't given such great definitions of what they mean by negative societal impact that I'm just like, huh? So, yeah, it's interesting and very tough. But I would very much ask the question of the researchers to wrap this out, because we're almost at an hour. I would very much find this particular question and be curious to hear the researchers answer this. How would you go about making sure that the ESR panelists themselves are not trying to push a particular worldview or their particular desired worldview onto the researcher submitting the grant? Because that does compromise scientific integrity. Because I could very much see, and part of the reason I ask this is I could very much see this ESR thing becoming politicized to the point where some people get grants because they're in favor and some people get grants because they're not because their work is good, more meritorious, as it has already gone through merit review and should have been funded. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to be thinking about it and to show that you've thought about it, but I also see a lot of potential problems with such things being politicized, and particularly with the influence of postmodernism, which, as I said, because postmodernism doesn't like debate and disagreement. Postmodernism is a dumpster fire. Postmodernism also doesn't care about the truth. Postmodernism cares about power, which, again, if you're looking at the postmodernism looking at everything through the frame of reference of dialectics and what have you, it gets to be such a mess, in which why postmodernism frankly has no place in science. But that is a whole other conversation. Interesting paper. Really find it interesting. Again, like I said, small sample size kind of makes it a little touch and go. Alongside the novelty problems, which they mentioned, so kudos to them. But that's it. I think it's an interesting paper for sure and raises some interesting thoughts. Let me know what you think in the comment section. I would be curious to hear your very many thoughts. I'm sure there's quite a few that have them. Um, like this video on the way out the door if you liked it. Comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. And until next time, I'm Adrian. Stay curious, everybody.